blue singlet beard strokers nationwide are literally embracing the teepee in their trousers that arose as a consequence of Ford releasing the pricing and some more specifications on the hotly anticipated Ranger Superduty. This is a vehicle, the gestation period for which would rival that of a human being, and also risks being among the most overhyped vehicles ever, even though frankly, it is quite impressive. I'd suggest that being overhyped, there's a fine line, isn't there? You can overhype something or you can just talk it up because that's your job, right? And I'd suggest that if this is a fine line, Ford just jumps over it. They do the gold medal winning long jump over that fine line every frickin' time. And the problem is, when you overhype something, even if it's fundamentally solid, it sets up a series of false expectations in the mind of the buyer, which is ultimately disappointing. So even though they get a blip of favourable media coverage where half brain-dead so-called journalists go, "Isn't that awesome?" they overdo it, right? And I want to come to grips with the overdone-ed nature of exactly this right now. And number one is obviously that the price that they're talking about is completely overhyped. This report is sponsored by NordVPN. Get a mega discount plus 4 extra months of Nord totally free right now. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC. Online security threats are everywhere, but you don't have to be the next victim. That's where NordVPN comes in, locking everything down efficiently in the background. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now. Every 2-year NordVPN plan receives that mega discount, plus a coupon for a stack of free data on Saily, which is Nord's innovative eSIM for travel. nordvpn.com/AEJC. Link in the description. Using NordVPN is easy. Just subscribe, download the app and connect. One click later, your IP address is shielded and your traffic is encrypted across as many as 6 of your devices. Nord is the fastest VPN on the planet, and it costs only about as much as a single cup of coffee every month to keep your data, your identity and your devices secure. Masking your location means you'll be able to access streaming and other services that might be blocked where you live. Plus, you can continue to watch your favourite content when you travel. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now. Boost your security, get that mega discount and enjoy those extra months, plus that free eSIM Saily travel data, all completely free. It's all totally risk-free with Nord's rock-solid 30-day money-back guarantee. It's easy to stay safe online. Visit nordvpn.com/AEJC now. If you look at their announcement yesterday, the single cab chassis Ranger Superduty is about $83,000. That's the manufacturer's list price, okay? 83 grand. And you go, but then upon closer inspection, it gets a lot more expensive than that. We'll get to that. So 83 for the single cab. The super cab, this is cab chassis all across the board, by the way, because the ute is not coming until a little bit later. So these are all cab chassis prices. And this really matters because it makes it look a lot better than it is. The super cab chassis is 86.5 grand, manufacturer's list price. And you think, that's pretty strong as well. The dual cab chassis is roughly 90 grand. Okay. And you think, yeah, that's still pretty good. Compared with, for example, a Troopy, this is a compelling vehicle, and not just on price, right? It's a compelling vehicle in terms of what it can do. So it could stand on its own merits and doesn't need to be ridiculously pumped up, but hey, let's ridiculously pump it up anyway. This is kind of how Ford's spin doctors roll. So the first problem with just looking at those prices and getting a bit of a stiffy over it and saying 90 grand, that's awesome, is that you have to add a tray, right? Because nobody wants to go for that long drive to Dingo Piss Creek just taking their rear half of their chassis rails for a little drive across the country. You have to add a tray. And Ford does have a genuine accessory tray in mind. It's a steel tray, obviously, because Super Duty, and it's going to cost between $6,000 and $9,500, which does seem pretty expensive to me. But hey, it's the genuine one, and you will not fall afoul of any warranty issues if you fit one, okay? So a dual cab with a matte black tray, which is the most expensive one, is going to be 98 grand, manufacturer's list price. 98 grand, okay? And then you have to get it on the road, which is going to cost you another $9,000. So that's $107,000. You're driving it away. It's got a tray and a rego plate, right? But you haven't pimped it at all, have you? And there's going to be a staggering number of Ford pimping it options, and then also obviously ARB, etc. will be quite happy to take as much cash as you care to throw at your Super Duty. So this is going to be realistically $110,000 to $120,000 proposition by the time you've got a Super Duty and it's legal to drive and you've pimped it ever so slightly. And I would suggest that making a pricing announcement with a headline of from $82,990 and actually having the price of the one most people are going to want, especially out here in the private user domain, right? The professional beard stroking retiree or something, and having an actual price that's $30,000-ish higher than that is really going to disappoint a whole bunch of people who are fantasizing about it now and for the next 8 or 9 months, whatever it's going to be, until you can actually buy a Super Duty. So the price sounds ridiculously good compared with what you are actually going to pay for yours. And I'd also suggest that the payload claims are massively overhyped. They're not inaccurate, they're just massively overhyped, because the payload on the single cab chassis has just been released and it's 1,982 kilos. The super cab chassis, 1,896 kilos. And the dual cab chassis, 1,825 kilos, okay? And obviously the payload is reduced because as the cabs get bigger, they get heavier, all right? The gross vehicle mass is 4.5 tonnes, and since we know both of those data sets now, we know the payload and the GVM, we can reverse engineer the curb weights. So the curb weights, I just calculated them, 2,518 kilos for the single cab, 2,604 for the super cab, and 2,675 for the dual cab. And obviously the reason that they get heavier is because the cabs get heavier. Same rolling chassis and running gear and powertrain and all that stuff. The cabs just get heavier. Okay, so 2,675 for the dual cab. The standard Ranger XLT dual cab chassis curb weight is 2,130 kilos and the GVM is 3,280. So you can assume from that with some sort of reasonable accuracy that super dutification adds roughly 550 kilos to the curb weight of the Ranger. Okay, so just Ford's engineers doing their mad voodoo down there at Yu Yang's whatever, their finite element analysis and having a little chat to the propeller heads at the factory. It's a little bit more than half a tonne extra just to turn a Ranger into a Ranger Super Duty. And that the GVM in absolute terms has risen by 1,220 kilos, but you've got to remember that 550 of that is intrinsically taken away, if you like, or embodied in the super dutification process. So what you're actually looking at in terms of the usable increase is about 670 kilos more, all right? That's not nothing, but you have to put it in perspective, because if you just read and regurgitate, as many journalists do, reading the announcement, regurgitating the numbers without the context and what it means for you, then the picture that gets painted is too optimistic in my view. It's like ridiculously optimistic. So 670 kilos extra, that's not nothing. That's better than nothing. But when you look at 3,280 GVM with your standard XLT dual cab chassis versus 4.5 tons GVM for your Superduty dual cab chassis, you think, what? But it's really just 670 difference because just over half a ton of it is embodied in the vehicle and therefore not really accessible to you from a utilization point of view. It's locked in there because they had to turn it from a standard Ranger to a Super Duty. So the payload standard for the XLT dual cab chassis is 1150, and for the Super Duty dual cab chassis it's 1825, and the difference is 675 kilos, which, as I said, is not nothing, but it's not as great as the frickin' hype, dude. Still pretty good compared with a Troopy. In fact, if I was a shot caller at Toyota, particularly a fleet sales shot caller at Toyota, I'd be leaking into my DAX at the moment, I think, and not in a good way. Right? I really would, because I think there's a lot of fleet managers out there in the private sector in particular who are going, you know what, we've always bought Troopies, but they weren't that reliable, frankly. They had brake issues and things of this nature. They haven't been staggeringly good. So there's more capability with the Ranger, and a lot of fleet dudes will be saying, well, how much worse could Ford be? And do we want to take that risk because look at this additional capability and we don't have to do any GVM upgrades and shit of that nature? So this could be a pretty good turnkey solution. Overhyped, but still pretty impressive. Of course, these masses look great and the price looks great, but you have to add a tray, right? Nobody wants to take their chassis rails to Dingo Piss Creek. You have to have a frickin' tray. It's kind of an accessory in official terms, but you have to add one. And 1825 kilos of payload, I'm not seeing a tray, like a steel tray going on this vehicle capable of carrying that much crap down some really hideous bumpy road. I'm not seeing you get any change out of about 400 kilos for the tray. I'm really not. And that basically is going to turn the real payload of these cab chassis vehicles into more like 1,400 or 1,450 kilos, right? By the time you add a tray. So if you read that announcement and it says, 1,800 kilos of payload for the variant you're after, you put the genuine tray on, you're going to lose 400 off the bat, okay? This is the beauty, I guess, of them just releasing the cab chassis variant because it makes the vehicle seem even better than it is. And this also sets up this false expectation that it's going to be just so much more shit hot at load carrying than it really is. And it is going to be shit hot at load carrying, but not as shit hot as the announcements imply, okay? The Ford licensed accessory steel tray comes in a few different options. It comes in gal or body coloured or matte black, and perversely the matte black one is the most expensive, and there's no word on whether or not the body coloured one or the matte black one is also galvanised, like underneath. I hope it is. It should be, because it's a couple of grand more. It's like $1,000 to $2,000 more for the painted option. I'd like to think that they didn't start with a bare steel tray and just paint it. I'd like to think that the $1,200 to $2,000, whatever it is that you're paying extra for the paint on the tray, is actually for the paint on the gal on the tray, because that's going to make it last a shit ton longer, isn't it, frankly, because of the cathodic protection, obviously. The colours at launch are going to be tan, black, white, mid-grey and silver. The prick tease green colour that they did their media walkarounds with. That's going to be coming a lot later in 2026. Single and super cabs are going to come first, and then dual cabs after that. I think dual cabs with a tub sort of thing, with the prick tees green. So I guess if you're really hanging out for prick tees green, it is going to live up to its name. Now, the maximum tow capacity is 4.5 tonnes. The GVM is 4.5 tonnes, and gross combination mass is 8,000 kilos. One of them. That's not 4.5 plus 4.5. And this means, obviously, that from a mass point of view, if you tow a 4.5 tonne trailer, then the maximum all-up load of the vehicle is 3.5 tonnes, equals 8 tonnes, 8,000 kilos, right? If you load the vehicle to 4.5 tonnes in total, you won't be able to tow more than a 3.5 tonne trailer, which is still kind of a lot, let's face it. But it's not 4.5 plus 4.5, so don't go off and assume that, will you? You got to bear in mind that if you put 450 kilos on the tow ball, it's slung out the back, right? That's probably going to be more like, I don't know, 600 kilos or something over the rear axle because of leverage. Thanks very much, Archimedes kind of thing. So you're going to have to watch the rear axle weight with this car, even though they have pumped up the front and rear axle weights. We'll get to that. I would suggest that a practical tow limit for this vehicle, and I know I will get some hate for saying this, but it's really 3 tonnes, you know? This thing would shit all over towing 3 tonnes. It really would. It'd be safe as houses with 3 tonnes. 3.5, maybe. But more than that, it'll be as shit at towing 4.5 tonnes as a standard Ranger is at towing 3.5 tonnes. It's just a bad idea to put a pig trailer with the centralised axle groups that's unstable intrinsically in pitch and yaw. It's a supremely bad idea to put one of them behind a vehicle that weighs substantially less than the trailer. Okay, it just is because of Newton, right? All of that inertia of the trailer, its instability and its ability to impose inertial loads on the vehicle, the loads are just excessively high if the vehicle's too light, and therefore at the speeds that ordinary Australians expect to tow at, like 100 k's an hour, then any instability in the trailer has the supremely high risk of just pushing the tow vehicle off the road. And there's only 2 countermeasures for that, dude. The first countermeasure is drive a lot slower, and the second countermeasure is tow a lighter trailer. Tow a trailer that is not heavier than the vehicle doing the towing, right? So specs say 4.5. I say if you want to bore your friends shitless with your tales of driving through busted-ass cattle scrub endlessly, 3 to 3.5 max. Now, the axle weight limits are kind of interesting on the Ranger Super Duty as well. 1,900 kilos front and 2,800 kilos rear. They're the limits, front and rear, 1,928. That would be up from in the standard XLT 4x4 and presumably the other variants as well, 1,490 and 1,959 kilos. So 1,490 on the front for the standard Ranger, 1,900 on the front for the Super Duty, 1,959 kilos on the rear for the standard Ranger, 2,800 for the Super Duty. Okay. In practice, though, especially with the dual cab variants, I would suggest that the rear axle load is going to be perhaps very likely to be the limiting factor, because let's face it, if you put, I don't know, 1,000 kilos in a tray on a dual cab, evenly distributed 1,000 kilo load, like, I don't know, you're tooling up for off-roading or something, or some big trip, whatever, you've got a service body on the back, you're a tradie, you work in the forests or in the mines, whatever, or you've got a dirty big water tank, or you work in agribusiness and you put different things on the tray that are all reasonably evenly distributed loads, then the equivalent load, wherever that's placed, the one force vector that you put in the tray that does the same thing as your evenly distributed load, that is going to be behind the rear axle. So 1,000 kilos on a dual cab in particular, because there's almost no tray forward of the rear axle, very limited forward of the rear axle. It's mostly behind the rear axle, and therefore it's cantilevered out the back, kind of like the toe wall download, although the lever arm is not as long. But if you put 1,000 kilos evenly distributed in the tray, you're going to put more than 1,000 kilos on the rear axle, okay? That's worth knowing. So if I was you, I would very carefully weigh the front and rear axles of the vehicle in its most heavily laded state at a weigh bridge, just to make sure that you didn't comply, like you've complied with the GVM and the GCM, so you think, yeah, all good, and the toe ball download is right. I would also, in particular, be measuring the front and rear axle loads very carefully, because especially with a dual cab Ranger, it's likely that the limiting factor is going to be the rear axle load. And you just want to be careful that you don't overdo it, because there'll be legal and insurance kind of implications if you're overloaded in any respect and, you know, you have some tragedy and then forensic investigators get involved, right? So you don't want to be doing that. You want to be carefully compliant, I'd suggest. So the ground clearance is kind of interesting too, because they revealed that yesterday. Depending on the cab variant, the ground clearance is between 295 and 299 millimetres. So what's that, about 3/16 of an inch, something like that difference? Not very much, but it's substantially more than a standard Ranger also. A standard Ranger XLT has ground clearance of 234 millimetres, so the Super Duty is roughly up about 60, which is a substantial hike in ground clearance. And you don't have to worry about compliance or being measured by the Highway Patrol or any of that stuff, because that's how it rolls out of the factory, which is a real advantage, right? So standard Ranger XLT, I just looked it up, it runs on 31-inch tyres. That's 31-inch OD, okay? I know we're a metric country, but tyres all get measured in their rolling diameter in inches, just like the wheels. So I would suggest that this means the most likely configuration for the Ranger Super Duty, and they haven't released it, but you can make an educated guess, is that it's probably running 33-inch tyres. Now, that's 2 inches bigger on the diameter, so that'll give you a 1-inch lift for that vehicle. And the other 1.4 inches of lift, 60 millimetres is about 2.4 inches, so there'd be 1.4 inches of suspension lift for the 60 increase in ground clearance, I'd suggest. That's probably the most likely combination, but it could also be 35-inch tyres, which is a 2-inch lift and a modest sort of half an inch 0.4 suspension lift to derive the same increase in ground clearance. So that is a substantial benefit for off-road driving, I'd suggest. Also the track, like the track is 90 millimetres wider. It's up from 1620 to 1710. So that's, 45 on each side, which will give you a bit of additional stability when you're off-road, but it'll also give a bit of additional stability in terms of cornering forces when you're driving around various bends. And that would be good also, because if the ground clearance is that much more, you'd want a bit more track just to have a similar kind of stability profile to a standard Ranger. And the wading depth is worth mentioning as well. It's up from 800 millimetres in the standard Ranger to 850, which is basically in line, kind of, within 3/8 of an inch at least. It's in line with the increase in ride height. So, yay, you get a bit of a wading depth bonus as well. So they have done, a substantial amount of engineering, like some of that increased mass of, a bit over half a tonne has to be wheels and tyres and suspensions and things of that nature. But there's also guaranteed a lot more metal in places in the chassis, I'd assume. Obviously, they want to tell you that they've done so much bespoke engineering, but in reality, they want to give it this performance and make as few changes as possible, because that's how engineering works. But half a ton of additional mass. It's not just wheels and tires, right? It's driveline components and axle components probably, and chassis components, because you can't add that much more mass carrying capability without rejigging at least a few things, I'd suggest. A couple of other things came to light. The AdBlue is going to be a feature of the Superduty because it needs to be Euro 6 sort of truck regulation compliant. So you are going to be stuck with AdBlue if you buy one. But the most interesting thing, I think, is the reduction in peak power. It's a substantial reduction in peak power, going from 184 with the 3-litre V6 in a standard Ranger, 184 kilowatts, down to 154, which is about 16% down. That's not trivial, especially considering that the vehicle, both unladen and fully laden, is substantially heavier. So that's like a double whammy of performance restriction at the peak. What they have done, though, is they've maintained the peak torque at 600 newton meters at the same revs too. So in the mid-range, the power production of that engine is going to feel pretty similar, but for overtaking, when you're likely exploiting high revs, the overtaking performance will be worse. It'll be worse two ways, because of the increased mass and also because of the reduced peak power, and there's really no getting around that. So what Ford says here is that this is a, quote, unique calibration. That's one way to categorise reducing the peak power by 16%. But I would suggest that it is a bilateral knee in the nuts for accelerative performance generally, because 16% less power, which is going to be lugging around either 26% more curb weight or 37% more GVM or 25% more gross combination mass. I mean, that's the mass increase envelope, depending on how you exploit it, for the Ranger Super Duty, and it's got 16% less power to do that. So that is bilaterally kneeing you in the nuts. You're not going to be able to match a standard Ranger, even when unladen, for things like overtaking performance. That's important to know, depending on how and where you drive and how often you overtake. And I don't know why. I don't know why it's been necessary to reduce the peak power of that engine. It's only the V6, like the 3-litre V6 in the diesel, obviously, in the Super Duty. You don't get an option for the 2-litre twin turbo, understandably. There has to be a durability type reason for that. I can't think of another reason. Like, Ford's announcement fails even to acknowledge, this is hilarious too, in the domain of overhyping everything. You've got to underreport anything negative to the point of not reporting it at all. So unique calibration is Ford speak for, yeah, we had to reduce the power by 16%. They don't even acknowledge that there's been a reduction. They just say it's a unique calibration. I find that hilarious. Now, what they do say is that the cooling system is 25% more efficient, unquote. And I'd suggest that that's a piece of engineering bullshit, you know, like a piece of spin. Engineering interpretation by spin controllers equals bullshit, right? I don't know that the efficiency of the cooling system matters for jack shit. I think what they mean is they've pumped up the cooling system so that it rejects 25% more waste heat. That would be in line with the increases in the mass that the car is hauling around, right? So the amount of work, meaning the amount of energy required to move 25% more mass, is 25% more. So presumably, if everything is equal, the engine makes doing the same job, but with 25% more mass, makes 25% more waste heat, and you need a 25% more robust, effective, whatever, cooling system to get rid of the additional waste heat from pulling 25% more mass from, I don't know, the beach to the top of the Victorian Alps, right? There's a fixed amount of work required to do that. It's 25% more if you haul 25% more mass through the same height. Ergo, you need 25% more cooling capacity. So I think that might be related to the reason for the reduction in peak power, because maybe it's just not possible to reject enough heat if you're making 184 kilowatts and you want to go off and make all of that mass perform to the tune of 184 kilowatts for a protracted period of time. It might not be possible. I'm just guessing there. It might also be a transmission limitation. I'm not sure. But in any case, the really interesting thing about the Ranger Super Duty is that I don't think Toyota has a countermeasure in the wings. I think they're going to rely on people being wedded to their Troopies or their Hiluxes or something of that nature. But the Super Duty is going to be a unique vehicle and also a much better vehicle, I think, than the recently released plug-in hybrid version of the Ranger. I think there's a niche for the Super Duty, and I'm not criticising it in the context of what it can do. I'm just criticising what Ford's had to say about it, because if here's your standard Ranger, in terms of maxing out and lifting heavy shit, right, or pulling heavy shit, whatever, then your standard Ranger is here. The Super Duty is here. Ford's hype about it is here. And if you're down here thinking about a vehicle and you're looking up at the hype and then you go for it and you discover that the hype is here and the performance is here, then that is going to be somewhat disappointing. And I think that's a real shame, actually, because Ford has the capacity to kick a real goal with the Super Duty, but it's a bit like the fuel consumption numbers. You know how every time you see a car and they say 6 litres per 100 Ks, and you think, what? 6? And you get out there and you drive as economically as you can. You get 8.5, right? And you think, you fucking bastards. If they said 9 and you got 8.5, you'd think, yes! I think the same problem pertains to the way Super Duty's just being oversold. And there are so many people who would just be receptive to it the way it is. Like 110, 120 grand for a Super Duty, okay, all up. If you come in at 115, you go, yeah. And if you think 4.5 tons, whatever, and the payload and all this, and you think you're going to be exploiting all of that and you haven't taken the 400 kilos off of the tray, that's going to gut you ever so slightly, even just a little stiletto in between the ribs. Not pleasant. If you just did the numbers in a more rational way and said, what this really means for you, dude, is blah, okay? If there was an element of that in the communication, you'd think, yeah, okay, that's pretty impressive. I'm just trying to bridge that gap between Super Duty hype and Super Duty reality. If it's right for you, it's still going to be right for you, but you need to be realistic about it. So I hope this helps.